You won't believe what this man did outsmart the most entitled HOA Karen in his neighborhood. So, picture this. A quiet countryside property. Green fields, a small stream, and across it, a handmade wooden bridge. That bridge was everything to George. He built it himself, plank by plank, just across the creek that separated his house from the main road. It wasn't fancy, but it was strong enough for his pickup and tractor. George was a retired engineer, and he liked peace, no drama, no noise. But then, the Homeowners Association decided to expand their reach, and with that came Karen. Karen wasn't her real name, but she fit the description perfectly. Loud, bossy, and absolutely convinced she owned everything within a 5-mile radius. She'd recently become the HOA president, and ever since, she treated everyone's private property like her own personal playground. And soon enough, her sights landed on George's little bridge. It began with a terse, formal letter slipped into his mailbox. It cited a dubious community aesthetic guideline and declared his bridge an unauthorized, non-compliant structure that required immediate removal. George, a man who preferred silence to shouting, simply tossed a letter and went about his day. This, of course, was an act of war in Karen's eyes. The next day, she marched right up to his property line, a binder of rules clutched to her chest. "Mr. Henderson," she shrilled, "that eyesore has to go. It devalues the entire neighborhood." George, who was oiling the bridge's hinges, didn't even look up. "It's on my land, ma'am, and it gets me to the road." "Your land is part of the HOA's visual purview," she retorted, a phrase she clearly practiced. "We have standards. This rustic thing violates them." The harassment escalated. She organized a vote to specifically ban privately built creek crossings. She began issuing daily fines. She even called the county, but they confirmed the bridge was on private property and perfectly sound. George paid the fines under protest and said nothing. But behind his quiet eyes, the mind of a seasoned engineer was whirring. He knew he couldn't win a war of words with Karen, but he could win a war of wits. One Saturday, a crew arrived at George's property. Karen watched from across the creek, a triumphant smirk on her face. She thought he was finally dismantling it, but George wasn't taking it down. He was taking it apart, methodically and precisely. Using a small crane, his crew lifted the entire bridge structure off its abutments and laid it carefully on his lawn. Karen was baffled. "So you're finally being compliant," she yelled across the water. George just gave a small, polite wave. For 2 days, his property was silent. The creek flowed uncrossed. Then the crew returned. But they didn't rebuild the bridge. Instead, they began pouring concrete and setting massive steel beams into the creek bed. They worked with an industrial efficiency that was far beyond a simple DIY project. What rose from the water over the next week wasn't a charming wooden bridge. It was a stark, utilitarian, heavy-gauge steel culvert system, wide enough for 2 lanes, topped with a compacted gravel roadway. It looked less like a country bridge and more like a temporary military crossing. It was, by any definition, an absolute eyesore, a brutalist scar on the picturesque landscape. Karen was apoplectic. She stormed over, her face purple. "What is this? This is 1,000 times worse. You've ruined the view." George stood calmly beside his new construction. "According to your own HOA bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph B, any structure intended for vehicular access to a public right-of-way is considered infrastructure," he explained, his voice even. "Infrastructure projects are exempt from aesthetic review, provided they meet county code." He handed her a stamped and approved permit from the county engineering department. The wooden bridge was a structure. "This," he said, gesturing to the monstrous culvert, "is infrastructure. It's fully permitted and, as you can see, highly functional." Karen sputtered, looking from the permit to the grim, gray steel. She'd used the rules as a weapon, and George, the engineer, had simply read the fine print and engineered solution. He had replaced something she found charmingly non-compliant with something perfectly legal, brutally ugly, and entirely bulletproof to her complaints. The wooden bridge, still intact, remained on his lawn, a beautiful sculpture and a testament to what she had lost. George fired up his pickup and rumbled triumphantly across the gravel-topped culvert. He had not only kept his access, he had proven that when you push a quiet man too far, he doesn't always push back. Sometimes he just builds a fortress. The sun-warmed gravel crunched under George's boots as he inspected the deep, aggressive tire marks gouged into the earth near his bridge. These weren't from his pickup or his tractor. These were the tracks of something far heavier, something that had no business on his land. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He followed the brutal scars, his heart sinking as he saw the same pattern imprinted on the grass leading up to the wooden structure he had built with his own hands. At first, he clung to the hope of a simple mistake, a lost delivery driver, perhaps. But when he woke at dawn the next morning to the sound of groaning timber and found a fresh set of even deeper ruts, his hope vanished. He brewed a strong pot of coffee, pulled a weathered lawn chair to a strategic spot under the shade of an old oak tree, and settled in to wait. He didn't have to wait long. The ground began to vibrate, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. Then he saw it. A colossal cement mixer, painted stark white, lurching like a behemoth toward his delicate bridge. The driver, high in his cab, seemed oblivious to the protests of the wooden planks, which bowed and screamed under the unprecedented weight. George was on his feet, waving his arms frantically, his shouts lost in the diesel thunder. The driver merely glanced down, offered a nonchalant shrug, and continued his slow, destructive crawl across. As the truck reached the far bank, a familiar champagne-colored SUV pulled up. Karen emerged, looking crisp and authoritative in a linen pantsuit, a clipboard held like a shield. George finally connected the dots. The HOA's long-gestating plan for a new community pavilion was underway on the empty plot just beyond the creek, and his bridge had been designated their personal, unauthorized highway. He marched across the trembling structure, his anger a hot, sharp stone in his throat. "This is private property," he stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You can't just drive industrial vehicles over my bridge." Karen slid her sunglasses down her nose, peering at him over the rims with a look of patronizing amusement. "Oh, George, do calm down. It's just a bridge. We're improving the neighborhood for everyone. A little community spirit wouldn't hurt you. You should be grateful we're adding value to the area." Grateful? The word echoed in his mind, absurd and insulting. He was supposed to be grateful for the systematic destruction of his property? The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of it took his breath away. He pointed a firm finger at the cement truck, now disgorging its gray slurry. "You will stop this right now. You are trespassing and causing deliberate damage." Karen's smug smile didn't falter. She gave a light, airy laugh that grated on his nerves like sandpaper. "If you didn't want people using your little shortcut, George," she chirped, her tone dripping with condescension, "you really should have built a gate." And there it was, the gauntlet, thrown not with a shout, but with a smirk. The casual suggestion wasn't advice. It was a declaration of war. She saw his home, his labor, his peace, as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to her ambitions. In that moment, the quiet engineer in George receded, and the strategist took over. She wanted a gate? Oh, he would give her a gate. And so much more. The battle for the bridge had officially begun. The next day, George took definitive, visible action. From his workshop, he produced a large, professionally painted sign in stark white and red letters. Private property, and no trespassing. Vehicles over 2 tons prohibited. He sunk the post deep into the earth at the bridge's entrance. For good measure, he arrayed a line of bright orange traffic cones and strung a heavy-duty chain between 2 sturdy posts, effectively creating a physical barrier. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. This was not a public road. He felt a small sense of satisfaction, a belief that even Karen would respect such a blatant demarcation. But his hope was naive. When he returned from a supply run later that week, his heart sank. The scene was one of deliberate vandalism. The orange cones had been violently kicked aside, one line cracked in the creek. The heavy-duty chain lay on the ground. Its thick master lock snapped cleanly, likely with industrial bolt cutters. And leading across the bridge, like a brazen signature of contempt, were the same deep, muddy tracks from the cement truck. That evening he saw her. Karen's SUV was parked at a vantage point overlooking the construction site, the glow of her phone illuminating her self-satisfied face. George marched over, his boots crunching purposefully on the gravel. He tapped on her window. She lowered it with an infuriatingly slow whir. "George, we really have to stop meeting like this," she said, a smirk playing on her lips. "You destroyed my barrier. You're driving a 30-ton truck over a bridge I built for a 2-ton pickup. You're going to break it," he said, his voice low and steady, fighting the tremor of rage. Karen let out a long, suffering sigh and rolled her eyes so dramatically it was a wonder they stayed in their sockets. "Oh, please. It's just wood and a little chain. You're so dramatic. If it breaks, and I highly doubt it will, we'll maybe fix it later. Eventually." She leaned forward, her voice taking on a tone of mock benevolence. "You should be happy we're developing the area. It raises your property value. You'll thank me one day." Just wood. The phrase echoed in his mind, minimizing years of careful labor, of selecting the right timber, of treating each plank. It was personal, a part of his legacy on this land, and she saw it as disposable kindling. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He tried the proper channels. He called the county, who reiterated the bridge was his problem. He called the HOA board, who nervously deferred to Karen, their president. He even called the sheriff's office. But a deputy came out, took a statement, and shrugged. "It's a civil matter, Mr. Henderson. Without clear video evidence of her personally causing damage, or unless the bridge actually collapses, our hands are tied." They were hiding behind bureaucracy, and Karen was exploiting every inch of that cover. The law moved too slowly to stop the destruction happening in real time. The system had failed him. So George stood on his porch, watching another laden truck rumble across his groaning bridge, and made a decision. If the law couldn't help him, and reason was deaf to Karen, he would have to speak a language she understood. The language of consequences. He would no longer try to stop them. He would instead, quite literally, set the stage for their downfall. He decided to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. A grim, determined smile touched his lips as he turned and walked back into his workshop. It was time to put his engineering degree to its most satisfying use. The moon was a cold, sharp sliver in the sky, casting just enough pale light to work by. George moved with the quiet efficiency of a man on a mission, his every action deliberate and precise. He knew Karen's schedule intimately. The cement trucks, always the same company, always the same model, rolled in like clockwork every other morning at 9 a.m. sharp. That gave him a perfect window. He wasn't a vandal. He was an engineer conducting a controlled experiment in cause and effect. He started by carefully prying up 6 of the key structural planks from the central section of the bridge, the ones that bore the brunt of the weight. He stacked them neatly on the riverbank. Now, a gaping, treacherous hole lay where solid oak had been. But that was too obvious. The artistry was in the camouflage. From his shed, he brought out several sheets of a 1/4-inch Lawan plywood, flimsy stuff used for temporary surfaces. He cut them to size and laid them carefully over the void, creating a false floor. Over this, he meticulously scattered a layer of dry leaves, dirt, and fine gravel he'd saved from the roadside, blending the patch seamlessly with the rest of the bridge's surface. To any cursory glance, even in the daylight, it looked perfectly normal. But underneath the clever facade, there was nothing but air and the waiting creek below. It was a trapdoor engineered for one specific payload. His final step was documentation. He mounted a weatherproof hunting camera high in the branches of a sycamore tree, pointed directly at the bridge's entrance. A second, smaller action camera was secured beneath the bridge, aimed upward at the compromised section. He needed irrefutable multi-angle proof. As the sun rose, George sat on his porch with a steaming mug of coffee, the very picture of rustic tranquility. The morning was peaceful, the only sound the gentle gurgle of the creek and the chirping of sparrows. Right on schedule, the low, grinding rumble of the cement truck shattered the calm. Karen's SUV appeared moments later, trailing the behemoth like a pilot fish. She pulled over, got out, and began her usual performance, waving the driver on with grandiose, impatient sweeps of her arm. George took a slow sip of coffee, his eyes fixed on the scene. The truck, laden with over 10 tons of wet concrete, eased its massive front tires onto the wooden planks. The driver, likely on Karen's orders to ignore the pesky signs, proceeded with cautious confidence. The bridge creaked its usual protest, but held, for now. The front axle crossed a hidden weak point. Then the center of the truck's immense weight settled directly over George's trap. The sound was not a simple crack. It was a symphony of destruction. A sharp, pistol-shot report of the plywood snapping, followed immediately by the agonized groan of the remaining supporting beam splintering under the sudden, catastrophic stress. For a heart-stopping second, the truck seemed to hang in space before the front end plummeted downward with tremendous, earth-shaking crash. The sound was not a simple crack. It was a symphony of destruction. A sharp, pistol-shot report of the plywood snapping, followed immediately by the agonized groan of the remaining supporting beam splintering under the sudden, catastrophic stress. For a heart-stopping second, the truck seemed to hang in space before the front end plummeted downward with tremendous, earth-shaking crash. The two front wheels vanished, and the truck's chassis slammed down onto the broken edges of the bridge, jolting to a violent stop. The driver was thrown forward against the seatbelt, his face a mass of shock. Inside the mixer, the wet concrete, destabilized by the impact, began to pour out of the chute like gray vomit, splattering into the creek and all over the shattered timbers. Karen's scream was not one of concern, but pure, incandescent fury. "You idiot! What did you do?" From his porch, George took a final, satisfied sip of his coffee. The bridge was ruined, yes, but it had been morally and legally ruined for weeks. He had merely guided its physical state to match the reality Karen had created. He had made sure its weakness was revealed at the perfect time, in the perfect way, with every second of it safely recorded. Now, the civil matter had just become a very expensive, very documented insurance nightmare. The wail of sirens cut to the countryside calm, heralding the arrival of a police cruiser, followed closely by the personal cars of several flustered-looking HOA board members. The scene was one of pure chaos. The cement truck nosed down in the creek like a beached whale, its contents slowly solidifying in the water and all over the broken bridge. The driver was on his phone, frantically calling his company, and Karen was in her element, a maestro of manufactured outrage. She descended upon the police officer like a hawk, jabbing a finger toward George, who stood calmly on his porch. "Officer, arrest him. This is deliberate sabotage. He booby-trapped the bridge to damage private property." The officer, a seasoned deputy with a weary expression, turned to George. "Sir, is that true?" George didn't say a word. He simply picked up his tablet, tapped the screen a few times, and handed it over. He played the footage from the tree camera first. A crystal-clear view of Karen, in her linen pantsuit, aggressively waving the massive truck onto the bridge, directly past the no trespassing sign and the severed chain. Then, he switched to the camera under the bridge. The video showed the truck's immense weight hitting the camouflage section, the flimsy plywood exploding inward, and the structural beams beneath snapping like twigs under the catastrophic load. "It wasn't a booby trap, officer," George explained, his voice even. "It was a structural demonstration. The bridge was clearly marked and blocked. Ms. President here ordered the driver to bypass those protections. My footage proves repeated, knowing trespass and the deliberate destruction of my property. The trap, as she calls it, was merely a visual aid to prove the bridge was never built for that weight." Karen spluttered, her face turning a dangerous shade of magenta. He weakened it on purpose." "The only thing weakened here, ma'am," the deputy said, handing the tablet back to George, "is your case." He turned to the HOA board members, who were looking on in horrified silence. "This is a clear-cut case of trespass and destruction of property. The civil matter just became a criminal one. The fallout was swift and decisive. The county, upon reviewing the evidence, fully sided with George. The HOA's insurance company was furious. They were not only liable for the total cost of the new bridge, but also for the astronomical expense of extracting the cement truck from the creek and the environmental cleanup of the spilled concrete. The legal fees alone threatened to spike everyone's dues for years. The quiet grumblings against Karen, which had been simmering for months, boiled over into a full-blown rebellion. Emboldened by George's very public victory, neighbors came forward with their own stories of her bullying and overreach. unapproved fence colors, fines for children's toys and yards, tyrannical letters about mailbox styles. At an emergency meeting, she was overwhelmingly voted out as president and effectively shunned. George, with the HOA's money, rebuilt his bridge. The new design retained the rustic wooden appearance he loved, but it was now supported by a skeleton of steel I-beams sunk deep into concrete abutments. It was indestructible. At both ends, he installed sturdy, lockable steel gates. And on his side, he mounted a small, custom-made sign, painted in the same style as his original warning. It read simply, "Bridge closed to HOA traffic." Now, whenever he drives his pickup across the solid, unwavering planks, a faint, satisfied smile touches his lips. He remembers the crack of splintering wood, the glorious sight of the stuck truck, and the beautiful silence that has fallen over the neighborhood since. And as for Karen, the rumors are true. She still complains. At every monthly HOA meeting, she can be heard muttering about that miserable old man and his stupid bridge. But there's a crucial difference now. She has to drive the long way around to get to the community clubhouse. She does all her complaining from the far side of the creek, a permanent and symbolic exile from the kingdom she once tried to rule.